With the popularity of streaming shows like The Boys and Invincible booming, I often wonder why more buzz wasn't generated by Netflix's own subversive comic book adaptation. Jupiter's Legacy! Nah, I'm just kidding, no one even knows that exists. But more people should definitely know about Super Crooks. Between Invincible becoming a smash hit and the ultimate underdog, Hitmonkey getting a season 2, somehow, I feel like I deserve some credit for that, things are looking up for adult animated comic book properties. But there's another show that's been out for 2 whole years and hasn't really gotten the same recognition or cult status as the other two, despite being one of my favorite shows I've watched lately. Netflix's Super Crooks is the very unique case of a Western comic being adapted into a Japanese anime format, with what looks to be a high budget and some really beautiful animation. I generally like to think that I keep my finger on the pulse of comic book adaptations, but over the last 2 years, this one somehow completely flew under my radar. Probably because I deleted my Netflix account after that stupid god-awful password sharing debacle was implemented, but then my wife started to miss all the K-drama shows on there and made a new one even though she wasn't actually going to watch them, so we're basically paying for it for nothing every month. But at least skimming through there one day after we had it back for the first time in a year caused me to accidentally come across this show. This series wonderfully adapts the 4-issue indie comic by Mark Millar and Lionel Francis Yu, but also expands on it and dives deeper into the story to ultimately make it even better than the charming comic. Let me tell you all the reasons I love Super Crooks. The timing of this video is a bit funny because just as I was planning to finally make it after mulling it over for a few weeks, writer Mark Millar has been getting repeatedly dunked on Twitter, even by the Joker somehow. And I'd like to preface this whole review by saying I'm not a giant fan of his or anything. In fact, I've downright hated some of his stories in the past, but it seemed like the guy was unavoidable for someone getting into comics in the 2000s like I was. He wrote The Ultimates, which is embarrassing in itself, but he also wrote Civil War, which is like a giant disaster where Iron Man is supposed to be in the right, but the book never makes a strong case for that, so it just ends with Steve Rogers dead and everyone has a really bitter taste in their mouth about Tony Stark. I like Kick-Ass 1 alright, both the comic and the movie, despite their faults. At least Kick-Ass made a strong case for indie comics getting big-budget adaptations again, along with all the other Marvel DC fare. But Kick-Ass 2 and 3 are just gross and unpleasant. Wanted is just edgy, try-hard trash. Nemesis is a good premise ruined by childish dialogue. Trouble? You guys remember Trouble? I own 2 copies of Trouble. My friend Jacob keeps giving me copies of Trouble. You know what's hilarious? I was really into Mark Millar books when I was like 14 and hated everything and I was angry at the world. I dove into so much of his work at that stage in my life, and naturally at the time I loved most of it. And I realized that's because I was the exact target audience for his stories. An angry 14-year-old. And once I grew out of that teenage angst mindset, I reread a bunch of them and I wondered what was wrong with my underdeveloped brain for liking this stuff. But for every edgy, over-the-top story full of exploitative shock value and miserable, unlikable characters, sometimes he writes something like Marvel Knight's Spider-Man. Or Huck. Or his run on Superman is actually really nice. I didn't hate his Wolverine stories, actually, even if it was pretty dark. Every once in a while, he drops something a little bit more hopeful and positive, with a spark of creativity that makes me second-guess my dismissal of him. And then I read the next thing, and then the cycle starts over. This takes us to Super Crooks, a 4-issue miniseries published in 2011 with art by Lionel Francis Yu. Filipino represent! This is one of the better comics I think Millar ever wrote. It's about an ambitious supervillain with electric powers, aptly named Johnny Bolt, gathering up a crew of other low-level villains to pull a major heist so they can retire from crime and get their mentor out of debt to a ruthless supervillain crime boss. These guys aren't world domination, weather control machine types. They're more like the kind of guys Spider-Man usually busts, like Shocker, Rhino, Sandman, and of course, Electro. You know, the really blue-collar supervillains that just try to rob banks and rough people up for money. Johnny's big idea to make off with a huge score for everyone in the crew is to acknowledge a fact that's present in both Marvel and DC universes. There's a ridiculous amount of superheroes in the United States, but plenty of countries have none at all. So they're off to Spain, where the only superpowers belong to another long-since retired supervillain that they plan to rip off, and his bodyguard, a disgraced ex-superhero that was shunned for all of his corruption. And while we don't get to see much of these characters, there's at least something there to find them all unique and interesting. Their personalities and power sets are on display just enough that I don't think they're totally boring. but they don't get nearly as much page time as Johnny Bolt and his telepathic girlfriend Casey. And of course, the overall plot feels a little derivative of Ocean's 13, with them all trying to pull a heist in order to save an older member of their crew that's indebted to another criminal. But that's only the broad strokes. The story itself has a lot of fun comic booky twists that use every crew member's powers in a fun, albeit sometimes kind of brutal way. Plus, it's got really pretty art from the same guy who drew that cheeked up Peter Parker turning around into Captain America, but ended up looking like really sexually charged instead of intimidating, because like, damn. This is like the "he's right behind me, isn't he" joke, but like done wrong because the person standing behind them looks a little too sexy.
Oh, is she behind me?
No, I'm in front of you.
I only looked up the book after I saw the Netflix adaptation on my recommendation, much like how I got into Hitmonkey. When I know there's not much in the way of source material, I always try to read that first before watching the animated version, so I have a point of reference about what they're trying to accomplish with that adaptation. And much like Hitmonkey, the anime hits all the high marks for me by expanding on the source material and building on what little was there in the miniseries. The first 10 episodes of this show are kind of like a prequel to the comic. Then the last 3 are just the comic. After signing a deal with Netflix to produce shows based on Millar's original comics, only 2 things have resulted: Jupiter's Legacy and this, and I'm pretty sure no one knows either one exists. But I can attest that the animated one is definitely at least worth watching. I also want to mention that I wasn't paid by Netflix to make this review, and I find Netflix to be arguably the shittiest streaming service out there because they think every TV series needs to break 1 million records in the first 3 days or it's a failure. So I will say that this show is pretty good, and I love the English voice cast. Look, that guy's Jet from Cowboy Bebop. No, the good Bebop, not the... Fucking Netflix, man, fuck him. I can't believe this isn't Matt Mercer. He sounds identical to Matt Mercer.
This is nothing, old man. I can keep it up all day. I can't think of a better time to showcase my style.
With animation by Studio Bones, like I said before, the Super Crooks anime adapts the 4-issue arc as the 3rd act of the story. But they also take time to pull it way back and give more time for all the characters, to give further context to their personalities and relationships, and to show how they met and pulled off a few previous heists before the events of the book. There's a lot more development for the individual characters and their relationships here. The first episode in particular is a dark comedy origin story about Johnny Bolt developing his powers as a young superhero fan. There's a whimsy and excitement and naive hope for the future. Then something horrible happens that I think you just need to see for yourself that pushes him into a life of crime. I think it adds a lot of depth to the character to know at one point he desperately aspired to be a superhero, and it just didn't work out that way. It's a nice way to have a criminal main character that we can still root for, because we know he wasn't inherently down for being a bad guy. Aw, look at him. He's just a funny little guy who probably complains about Spider-Man 2099's costume being the wrong color on the internet. Hey, this is actually the most high-selling piece of merch I've ever put out, so go buy even more. Ironically, I prefer the character designs from the prequel part of the show before the events of the book start. Johnny looks fresh as fuck with that facial hair. His status as a supervillain is hammered home more as a character flaw that he's trying to shake in the series. And while you want to see Johnny finally kick the habit, his adventures are so cool, you also kinda don't. My favorite episode of the series by far has to be episode 3, where Johnny and a bunch of his personal supervillain friends rob multiple jewelry stores at once, and are beset upon by legions of police and a handful of pain-in-the-ass superheroes. I think it's cool to demonstrate firsthand just how saturated the US is with these guys to further drive home the point about why it's a good idea to bring this team elsewhere later in the series. This episode is essentially all one long chase/fight scene with no interruptions, and it's fun to see all these powers on display. I also think it's kind of funny this is a world where the supervillains are just average Joes trying to make ends meet, and the superheroes are obnoxious, overly brutal celebrities. I often find The Boys, the comic, not the show, irritating for having no real supervillains, like, at all, and pretty much exclusively focusing on evil heroes. The world of Super Crooks isn't delved into much in the book, but the show attempts some stronger world building to mixed results. I do like the idea that some supervillains have met each other before or hung out, and others haven't. It's like multiple people in the same career field getting put on jobs together. But the show also makes an attempt to come up with an excuse for why a lot of people have powers without specific origins, and unfortunately it's supposed to be a tie-in to Jupiter's Legacy and some half-assed attempt at a Millar world shared universe. Johnny Bolt has powers simply because his father, who we never meet or see, must have also had powers or been a descendant of these mooks from the island in Jupiter's Legacy. Fuck, I'm getting tired of saying that title. Look, this doofus invented X-Men again. How groundbreaking. But thankfully that shit's not important and they don't really go into it much. And with that, the world building is sort of shaky because the ties to the other show are tenuous, and their character cameos in the middle of the show feel like weird and annoying advertisements that didn't need to be there. Like, you could have had any random Superman archetype guy in this scene. If anything, these bozos showing up makes me care about Puppeter's Legacy even less, because these guys are markedly less interesting than the actual Super Crooks. The characters here are oozing personality with great costumes and cool backstories and fun powers, and those guys are just more morally dubious Superman send-ups. Yawn. But they do make a good mark for a really cool heist in the middle of the show. Imagine breaking into the Hall of Justice to steal Dr. Fate's helmet from the Justice League. God, the premise for this show is so fun. I wish Sony would stop shitting their pants in front of everyone constantly about the Spider-Man license and do a Superior Foes movie with this kind of tone. That comic is practically designed for a fun action comedy heist buddy movie with bumbling Spider-Man bad guys. But no, they're over here doing Kraven getting radioactive lion blood. Why is everything rated R except the movie with Carnage? Speaking of blood and violence, this show can get pretty gory, but it's handled tastefully, I think. It's either the result of the main villain, known as the Bastard, using his powers to blow up people's heads, or the Diesel twins using their really awesome healing powers. I've always thought healing factor powers could be used in really creative ways, and this show makes a great use of that. If there was ever a Deadpool animated series, I hope they do shit with his regeneration half as cool as this. These two are jumping into propellers, getting hacked apart with lasers, and smuggling themselves into places in suitcases with their limbs chopped off to better fit in small spaces. I never thought this show was using extreme violence to be edgy or gratuitous. It's always fun and creative, or at the very least, extremely well animated when they're going for a more serious tone. Gotta censor some of that shit for the YouTubes. I also think it's cool how faithful this series is to the comic, with some minor exceptions that were good changes. For one, the Bastard is given more of a direct connection to the Super Crooks as the series progresses, because in the comics they didn't really know him or have any reason to target his fortune other than just, well, he's rich. But now, he's old friends turned enemies with their mentor, and he has multiple run-ins with them before they choose to rob him in the last few episodes. Plus, the show just treats one of the most badass characters from the book, the Gladiator, with a little bit more love. He gets more action scenes, more screen time to show how he's one of the few morally upright superheroes in this world, and the way the Super Crooks rope him into their plan is a little less mean-spirited to me. In the book, they kind of blackmail him into helping with the heist because he's seeing men behind his wife's back. In the show, he has a boyfriend instead of a wife that we see earlier in the series, so it seems less like they're blackmailing him for being gay, and more just the cheating part. So it makes the events that happen to him in the epilogue sit a little better. And I just love him being voiced by original Leonardo voice actor Cam Clark.
I'm a real superhero, you asshole.
The other changes that I don't really mind are things like the decision to switch the setting for the climax from Spain to Japan. The comic story was come up with by Millar and Nacho Vigilando, who likely chose Spain for the setting because it's his home country. But the show's screenplay was done by Dai Sato, who likely changed it to Japan because it was something a little bit more familiar for the show's crew to work with, depicting as like an alternative to the US. At least that's what I thought. It doesn't affect the actual course of the story at all, but I do find the change interesting. If there's one thing I'll knock points off for in the series compared to the comic, I'd say the dialogue in the English dub, at least, isn't as snappy as Millar's script. Mark Millar is good at writing chatty characters with a lot of attitude and potty mouths, but the characters in the show are a bit more soft-spoken and polite by comparison. It works for the villain Praetorian because his vulgarity in the comic comes off as a little bit more childish, and he's more threatening in the show with his air of classiness despite being such a brutal monster. Casting DC Douglas was an inspired choice for him, but some of the other characters could have definitely sounded a little bit more rude and in-your-face. I guess that's what happens when you translate from English to Japanese back to English again. And yes, I watch the show in English because the dub cast is really good. And my rule is that I prefer the English version when the characters are English-speaking characters from an English-speaking country. It wouldn't make sense to watch a Spider-Man anime in Japanese, they're a bunch of New Yorkers. Forget about it! And yes, the original cast is also good. So, no matter which way you watch it, it'll be a blast. Along with Hitmonkey, Invincible, and Spawn, I'm happy this show exists so we can have some adult-oriented superhero stories and animation. If these were on a list of my favorites in terms of quality, I'd probably do it like this. Much like the Marvel anime I reviewed last year, this really makes me wish Japan would take more cracks at adapting Western comic stories, especially with their style of adaptation. At the risk of sounding like one of those fucking annoying Japanese thing better than American thing guys, I do have to admit that I prefer the way they adapt comics there. In Japan, the manga is your script and storyboard, and the animators take great pains to draw the characters and locations just like the mangaka's personal art style. You really feel there's a great respect for the source material and the storytellers behind them. In the West, it's always someone else putting their unique spin on it, or viewing it through a new lens, or paying tribute while doing something new, and most of the time that translates to 3 or 4 minor plot points from the comic being used, sometimes in completely different contexts, and if you're really lucky, they'll occasionally use a scene from the book that happens to be pretty well known on its own. Again, usually in a completely different context. Aside from The Max, 2003 Ninja Turtles, and Invincible, the US typically has this fuck 'em, do it our own way approach to the adaptations, and it's shocking how rare and infrequent it is to just animate the story that was already pretty good. Comic accuracy is a tricky thing because sometimes comic books are confusing, messy garbage that needs to be whittled down to the broad strokes to make sense in a new format. And that works well for some stuff. But other times I get tired of having to see someone else's unique spin or reimagining of something. Because I like the story already as a comic and I just thought it'd be cool to see that play out in an animated format. There's a world of difference between static panels on a page with text bubbles and seeing that in motion with a good score, talented voice actors, and fluid animation. It's especially cool when the art style for the show looks like the art from the comic, just modified for animation so it can move well. I rarely ever get direct translations for these types of shows, so I treasure any of the ones that do come out. And you know, I couldn't give less of a shit about a live-action version of this if I tried. Just from the opening alone, I'm positive this could never be topped in live action. Look how good they look! They're busting a move! Around the same time Jupiter's Legacy got cancelled,
My legacy.
they also announced a live-action adaptation of Super Crooks was coming. Much like the proposed live-action adaptation of Invincible, it's utterly pointless. You already nailed it in animation. This is really all you needed to do. You could have quit while you were ahead. I don't need to see miscast actors and over-designed horrible renditions of the costumes enacting a heavily truncated version of a long-form story mashed into a 2-hour format where they stand around with their masks off before turning into messy CGI puppets for poorly choreographed fight scenes. I'm getting tired of that shit because I've seen it a million times before. And if I had to choose between the two, I'd say the cartoons are always better because it looks like a comic book brought to life. Most of the time the live-action shit just looks like, well, just gray CGI sludge. Live action always gets treated as the be-all, end-all form of storytelling, as if comics or animation or video games aren't good enough and they need to be turned into a big-budget Hollywood live-action adaptation to be legitimized. I don't think Super Crooks needs to be in live action because I know none of the awesome stuff that I like in this show won't look half as good in that format. You nailed it already. Be proud of that instead of trying to take it a step further, Netflix. Greedy bastards. They canceled Santa Clarita Diet! With all that being said, I do love and recommend this show in spite of the fact that it's written by sort of an annoying dweeb and produced by a shit-ass streaming service that constantly destroys any good ideas they touch and hates animation. Somehow a good one slipped through the cracks, and it's lucky it only had to last 13 episodes or else it'd be cut short on a cliffhanger too. I always get mad at YouTube for not putting my videos in the subscription box because people will comment, "Finally, Xavier uploads again after all these years," not knowing 3 other videos came out within the last month already. So maybe that stupid bell icon thing will help you remember I exist. If you want other ways to support the channel, you can always go hit up that Patreon for early videos and exclusive stuff because it's just $1. I'm not kidding, it's only $1. Isn't that cool? If everyone who watched this video donated $1 a month, I'd be able to afford a house for myself, so that would be really cool. You can also check out our merch on TeePublic, or just buy some of my random stuff on eBay. I have a pretty substantial collection of old toys that are still in the box in perfect condition, so go take a look in case you find something you like. And lastly, since this is a YouTube video and you probably play Fortnite, drop my creator code XavierGM next time you buy a silly dance or a cool character skin. Really helps me out. See you next time!